Good evening. Welcome to our Your Voice, Your Future School Safety Town Hall. Uvalde moving forward. I'm Hema Muller.
I'm Jonathan Martinez. It's been 1 year since an 18-year-old gunman walked into Robb Elementary School in Uvalde and opened fire, ultimately killing 19 students along with 2 teachers. Since then, the conversation about gun safety and school safety, well, it's ramped up. Today, we are taking questions from you, viewers right here in Texas, about what you'd like to see changed when it comes to school safety.
We'd like to introduce our panelists for you. We have State Representative Goodwin joining us, who represents Western and Southern Travis County.
As well, we have conservative political strategist Brendan Steinhauser.
Now, we would like to note we did invite more than a dozen Republican state lawmakers to join us tonight. We either did not hear back or they declined our invitation, but we are thankful to the both of you for joining us here tonight.
Now, since the Uvalde school shooting a year ago, lawmakers have said this will be the session to address school safety, but have stopped short of any gun legislation that many Texans have said they support.
CBS Austin's political reporter Michael Atkinson joins us in the studio tonight with a look at some of the sweeping school safety legislation.
The legislature didn't meet last year, and Governor Greg Abbott never called a special session to address school safety, to the disapproval of many Democrats. And with the session ending very soon, each of the 2 chambers are sending mixed signals on how to address school safety. Over the course of this session, school safety has had a divided outcome. Lawmakers are negotiating on a school safety package that would allocate hundreds of millions of dollars for security updates, far less than the House of Representatives have originally called for, and leaving behind much of the gun legislation Democrats wanted.
We could have done that. We should have done that. We should be walking out of session saying we prevented the next Uvalde, and that didn't happen.
House Bill 2744, which would raise the age to purchase certain semi-automatic firearms to 21, didn't make a key deadline by the House of Representatives, effectively killing the bill. That bill had been backed by many of the families of Uvalde victims.
Because at the end of every day, I'm just a mom who wants my daughter back, and a mom who doesn't want another mom to know my pain.
But recent polling shows the majority of Texas voters, more than 3 out of 4, wanted that kind of legislation and more. Since then, House Democrats have attempted to revive the provisions within that bill onto other policies with little success. House Republicans, meanwhile, are searching for alternatives, including Republican Jeff Leach, who represents Allen, where a mass shooting occurred in the middle of session.
We should be interested in being careful and safely guarding our Second Amendment rights, but also doing the right things that can curb unnecessary and tragic gun violence.
And such a bill would have had little chance of passage in the Senate. Few lawmakers have staked as much of their political rapport on firearms control as Democratic Senator Roland Gutierrez, who represents Uvalde. Not one of his bills was taken up by the Senate.
I'm angry for that community. I'm angry that nobody listened to them in here. I'm angry that the Republicans pay lip service to this stuff. They truly don't care. They care more about guns than those kids.
In the final days of session, both chambers have approved school safety legislation that invests in school security and mental health, rather than firearms control. The question is how those policies will look by the end of Texas's legislative session in just a few days, and how well they can prevent the next tragedy.
Since the deadly shooting at Robb Elementary, Texans have wanted to know what is being done to keep intruders out of schools and to prevent dangerous situations.
So what's been done this legislative session to address those concerns? That is our first question of the night. Representative, we'll send it over to you.
Well, House Bill 3 was on the House floor. It was our big school safety bill, although I'm hearing that now it's going to be Senate Bill 11. And so there are some good things in the bills. There are some things that I don't agree with. One of which is having an armed person or armed employee on every school campus. And I think that taking a statewide view of something that is, school districts across the state are very different one to the next, that I think local school boards should have the ability to make decisions on who is in the school for safety, like a school resource officer, or in some districts they may approve armed teachers.
Same question, I guess, Brendan, what do you feel is being done so far this session?
Yeah, I think there's a lot being discussed currently. I think the one big theme I see from Republicans is we need to harden these soft targets, because what we're seeing is that criminals are targeting schools, churches, temples, places where they're so-called gun-free zones, but unfortunately we know that criminals take their intent and take their intent to kill to places that are seen as soft targets. So I think what Republicans in the legislature are trying to do with these bills is to harden those targets and to say, yes, we want to encourage well-trained people who are competent in the use of handguns or other defensive weapons to use them in case they have to in a horrible, tragic situation that we have seen time and time again.
And, there has been discussion about, you mentioned arming people in schools. I mean, from your perspective, is that something that you want to see? Have you heard from educators, teachers, do they want this?
No, absolutely not. At least in my area, in my district, the teachers do not want to be armed. In fact, we see that so many teachers are leaving the profession, and one of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons is now they are in charge of protecting their children, their students, and I don't think teachers, for the most part, want to be armed and want that role. That's for law enforcement.
Now, HB 3, part of it, I believe it did address having panic buttons in schools and items like that. Do you think that that goes far enough? Do you need the armed person in the school?
I think you do. I think police response times, as quick as they can be, are often too long to stop these shootings from happening. Often these killers can commit their crimes in a very short amount of time. So I think the only way to mitigate that is to have people who are trained, who are confident in the use of arms in the classroom, principals, superintendents, volunteers. Like we have this Guardian program in the state of Texas. That is a locally run initiative. If the school district chooses to have, retired law enforcement in or veterans who are there to provide that safety and security, they're able to. So I think we should be encouraging that as a last line of defense with all these other security measures that also have to be considered.
And Michael, Representative Goodwin did mention some possible changes to HB 3 that the Senate is taking up. What do you know about that?
Yes, we do know that the House Bill 3 has been significantly stripped down from the form that was passed out of the House. The House version had a fiscal note of about $1.25 billion, and we know that the version that's just come out of the Senate Education Committee is clocking it at about $328 million. So nearly 3/4 of the spending has been stripped away. It does still do some things like create, through the Texas Education Agency, the Office of School Safety, and it does do some of the minor things like requiring safety plans for people to safely leave out of buildings, know what they're going to do in the event of a school shooting should that happen. But some of the noted things that it doesn't include is that it strips away funding per student. That's going to be, when it was in the House, the version that the House passed, it was $100 in spending per student at every school to go towards school safety. That's been lowered down now to just $10 a student. It does still include $15,000 for every school campus to go towards school security funding. We also do know that it has been stripped down of the requirement that armed security officers are going to be in every campus. That was something that the House had voted on and approved, saying that they wanted to have at least one armed security officer of some kind in every campus and every school. That's no longer a requirement under the version of House Bill 3 that was just passed out of a Senate committee. It's a recommendation, and it does give the authority to do so, but it's no longer a requirement within that bill. And as I mentioned, that is something like 3/4 of the bill has been stripped away. Though, to be fair, the House committee, when it was essentially at the same level, the House committee version that was passed out had a fiscal note of just $292 million, and much of it was added on later on, but that is what we've seen so far.
Yeah, and quick follow-up question, Michael. You're covering politics day in, day out, from the start of the session to the middle of it now to the end. Is everybody staying down party lines? Is anyone deviating, or is it as is?
You have seen a few Republicans, particularly the couple that were on a committee with Representative Goodwin here, who voted to see the significant bill that would raise the age to purchase certain semi-automatic weapons. A couple of Republicans did vote with mostly Democrats in saying that they did want to support that bill. But what's been really interesting, I've noticed, is that the Republicans who have shall I say, broken with party lines, have been very quiet about it. We've reached out to them to see if they want to speak with us and offer any comments, and we really haven't heard a whole lot from them. We did see one of the representatives, I'm not remembering who it was, it may have been Representative Holland, who posted online essentially saying, I still do believe in the Second Amendment, and I don't think that this bill inhibits that, but they have been noticeably quiet on their legislation in that effort.
And we also did want to open up the questions that we got from our viewers as well. One of the questions that we got, and this is a common thing that people talk about, they say it's not guns that kill people, it's people who kill people. So why are lawmakers coming for our guns? That is a rhetoric that we hear a lot of times. People kill people, not guns. So what do you say to address that question? Brendan, I want to start with you. I mean, that is something that does have more of a conservative lean to it. People don't want their guns taken away. They're very afraid of that. So how do you address that?
Yeah, they are, and I think that it's also speaking to this mental health issue that we face in this country, and this is a huge societal, moral problem that we face when we have people who are willing and able to go and commit these horrible, heinous acts. And so I think, in almost every case you look at, these people fit a paradigm, they fit a pattern of behavior. They're often warning signs, they post hateful comments on social media, they tell friends or family that they're going to do something, they make threats. And so there is certainly a mental health thing that I think Republicans have been, shouting from the rooftop saying this is a big part of this debate. Yes, we need to talk about everything else, but we cannot ignore the fact that this is a human problem and we have to get to the core of that as well.
Representative, same question to you for folks who say we feel lawmakers are coming after our guns. Others who say, look, that this is the guns in the end that carry it out.
Yeah, I mean, a gun is a tool. When someone has an intent to do harm, that gun makes it much easier to do much more harm much more quickly. And so I think that we do have to have regulations around guns. I'm certainly not in favor of taking away someone's Second Amendment right, but I am in favor of having regulations for that right. There are many things that we could do that would not infringe on someone's ability to own a gun. Someone with a criminal background, for example, who buys a gun through our loophole, going to a gun show and a personal sale, we need to close that loophole.
And what have been the conversations so far this session about mental health and resources for that aspect of this?
I mean, we talk about mental health quite a bit in the legislature, but we still don't fund it adequately. And I hear stories regularly of people going to see a mental health therapist who are paying for it out of pocket. So while we are supposed to have mental health parity, it's supposed to be treated the same as physical health, it's not.
And we do want to pivot. Uvalde families have been at the Capitol throughout this entire session. Of course, they are in support of gun legislation.
And they were especially vocal about House Bill 2744. That would have raised the age to buy a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21.
It doesn't take your guns away. Mind you, it doesn't take the ability of those folks to get a gun. It just raises the age from those folks that are 18 to 21 from purchasing.
When is it going to be enough?
Families say their experience proves that this is a matter of life or death.
Now, we addressed it just a second ago. Michael mentioned it. We saw HB 2744 make it out of committee on that last possible day. And Michael, there was a big reaction. As you said, there were a couple of Republicans who did vote alongside Democrats on that. And there was a lot of big emotional reaction. You were there for that. What was that like?
Absolutely. And obviously Representative Goodwin played a key role in that. But what was so interesting about it to me is that there was this big push because the vote came the day, or the first day session met after the mass shooting in Allen that had happened over that weekend. And so there was such a grassroots push by gun control advocates that day. Up to that point, it felt, at least from the reporting side, that bill really didn't have so much of a chance, and it felt like it was going to be dead in committee. There was a key House deadline later that week. And what we saw essentially was the day the House met after the shooting, there was several activists in the floor who said, there's this, now is the time, now more than ever was the time to get this bill to have a vote on the committee. That was kind of the key question, was whether or not this committee would even take up the legislation for a vote. Otherwise, it essentially would have been dead. It wouldn't have met that key deadline. And so what was really interesting, I thought, was after we saw Republican Representative Jeff Leach on the floor speak about the Allen shooting, there was then just this question of meeting. And we're still not even sure, and maybe Representative Goodwin knows what persuaded the chair of that committee to then decide to have a committee meeting. But what we saw essentially after that was this big push. And I remember when they said, there's going to be a hearing at 12:30, you could see everyone running down to the Capitol building extension trying to get to this meeting. You saw dozens of people, many of them the families of the Uvalde victims, as you saw just there, ready to take part and witness this vote. And there was just this emotional outpouring when the vote came out. Everyone kind of cheered the supporters of the bill, and then almost immediately after that, there was just this hush over the room as so many of them just began crying, bursting out into tears. Essentially, it was very emotional in that room for sure.
And maybe Representative Goodwin can give us a little bit of background idea, kind of take us to that moment and walk us through what exactly happened that day. How did we get there?
Well, I think, very unfortunately, Allen, the mass shooting that happened in Allen was something that, again, led all of us to feel like we have to do something. And so over the weekend on Sunday, some of us got together and talked about some floor strategy. I think that the chairman and speaker didn't really want to see a lot of emotion on the floor over this raise the age bill, and so they decided maybe it would be best to have a meeting to vote the bill out. And many of us had been putting pressure on the speaker, Chairman Guillen, to at least give these families the respect they deserve by giving the bill a vote.
And Brendan, I guess same question to you there. Why is it that lawmakers can't seem to come to an agreement when it comes to any type of gun reform or gun legislation, in this case HB 2744?
Yeah, I think it's a clash of vision and philosophy. It's a clash of what should be done, what the right policy is. I think to the hearing, I think it absolutely had to do a lot with their empathy and sympathy for the families, and I think they were asking for a vote, they got the vote, but it just turns out that Republicans and Democrats just don't agree on the right policy to pursue. Now this raise the age bill, may or may not have prevented this shooting. It's hard to go back and look, but one thing we have seen is that when we increase gun control measures, people who are intent on committing these atrocities find a way to access the guns, whether it's illegally, whether they steal them, whether they have someone else buy them, and that's the unfortunate thing. So I think that we have to be smart about the policies that we pursue, but again, I go back to ultimately when I think about stopping this in a place like a church or a classroom, we have to make sure that our citizens are able to defend themselves, their families, and their communities.
And we mentioned Representative Leach, a Republican from the Allen area, and he was very impassioned when he spoke about this. And of course, we saw some conservative lawmakers voting with the Democrats. So how far apart are these two sides? Where is that push for compromise? Does it exist?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say the key point of this too is that the voters are also very far apart. So some legislators may not be as far apart when they really get behind closed doors and have these conversations. But I think going back to what we talked about earlier, on the right and the left, the voters, the primary voters, are very far apart philosophically. And so they're frankly getting pressure from the left or from the right to go one way or the other. And so when lawmakers do get into the room, they're thinking about their constituents and they're thinking about those very active, activists on both sides. And so as a country, we're very much not in agreement on this. So it's one of those policy issues that's been with us for a long time, and we just got to find a way forward. Well,
speaking of voters, about 81% of registered voters nationwide do support raising the age to buy a firearm to 21. That according to a recent Fox News poll. Meantime, the Texas Politics Project also finding that 76% of Texans also support raising the age to purchase a firearm to 21.
Yeah, and we were kind of talking about it there, but where is the disconnect overall between Texas politics and this polling data that we see? They never quite seem to line up. So, Brendan, I'll ask you that.
Sure. Well, yeah, I think if you break the numbers down and just splice that up and look at Republicans versus Democrats and independents, you're going to see that divide pretty clearly. So if you look at just Republicans and how they feel, they're absolutely opposed to that particular policy, whereas Democrats are absolutely for it. So even though you're polling all of Texans, when you really get into the people that decide elections, for the most part, it's primary voters, and in this state, it's Republican primary voters. And so, frankly, politically speaking, I think the Republican elected officials are, listening to the people most active in their party, and I also think that they, frankly, believe in, most of the things that their voters believe in. There may be some differences here and there, or they may want to be willing to, concede some things here or there, but they know that ultimately, like you said earlier, Texans do not want the government to get anywhere close to gun confiscation, and that is their ultimate fear.
But even with that, that's just saying let's raise the age. They're not necessarily confiscation, and that's an overwhelming majority in two separate polls there for folks who do say, hey, we support that. It's not a matter of taking away the guns. What do you tell those individuals?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different policy, but I think that most Republican voters I talk to, they're going to say this is just, anything we give, any inch we take, or any inch we give, they're going to take another one. They're going to take another one. This is the first step. So that is definitely the mentality. And I think too, when you have, other politicians out there, especially, on the Democratic side, like Beto O'Rourke, who famously said, hell yeah, we're going to take away your AK-47, we're going to take away your guns. That doesn't help in terms of the optics for the Democrats, because that's really what they remember more than the nuances of the legislation moving in the Capitol right now.
And Representative Goodwin, I'll ask you, I mean, especially in the wake of the Allen shooting that was recent, you had all those Uvalde families who were there day after day at the Capitol. I mean, what was the conversation with your colleagues across the aisle? I mean, was there that push to want to come to a compromise, to want to do something for these families?
I think that we all want more safety. We all want to protect our kids when they go to school, when they go to a mall. I think in conversations with them, in fact, one of the members that voted for raising the age, Sam Harless, he looks to his grandchild and says, I want a safe world for my grandchild. And so I think they understand that. The difference is how do we make things safer? And I think for a long time, the Republicans have said more guns means safer. But we've seen in a number of examples where that's not the case. In the Tennessee shooting, there was somebody on the school campus with a gun. That was not, you have to be right at the right spot, even if you have an armed person in a school or at a shopping mall. We just have gotten too many guns. And so my belief and many of the Democrats is more guns are not making us safer. Let's look at the data.
Speaking of that conversation and the Allen shooting, the mass shooting, do we feel as if that shooting helped or hurt the conversation as it pertains to gun reform, gun legislation?
Well, so with the example of raising the age, that wouldn't have helped in that situation because the shooter was 33 years old. So I think you have to look at a comprehensive group of laws. And you have to say, look, even if we're changing one law that might not have helped in one particular case, policy gives a signal to your community and to society. If we say we're going to set some policies that regulate guns to make sure that we're safer, that sends a signal to society. Right now, after last session, we passed permitless carry. So what we're saying is we think we need to loosen the laws, and that's sending the wrong signal.
All right, same question to you. Hurt or help in this case, and yet another mass shooting here in Texas?
Well, it certainly draws more attention to it, and it makes it a debate that more people are talking about and thinking about and debating. So there's a lot of emotion, rightfully so, but there's also a lot of, I think, thoughtfulness with this. The one thing I'll say, kind of going back to that argument about, guns and crime, we spend a lot of time at the state capitol. The state capitol is filled with DPS troopers who are armed to the teeth. There are people that walk in the Capitol every day who are citizens who carry into the Capitol. The Capitol building is probably one of the safest buildings in the city and one of the safest in the state. And so I would argue that, to the representative's point, you can't have one person be everywhere, but that's why we need multiple people in these schools, multiple people in these so-called gun-free zones to be armed and trained and ready to defend themselves and others, because that is ultimately what is going to deter the crime in the first place, and secondarily to put an end to it if it does happen.
And talking again about the Allen shooting quickly, we saw a lot of those families that came to the Capitol just this week, and they were talking to representatives. Michael, you were there for some of that as well. I mean, again, we have so many victims' families that are coming here. I mean, what are you seeing the conversation with lawmakers? Are you seeing their attitudes change?
Yeah, there have been a lot of folks, especially from the Santa Fe high school shooting, who have been coming as well. That was not so far from recent memory. We saw a lot of those folks also make the same efforts towards gun control legislation. I think that following the Allen shooting, what was really interesting is Uvalde and then Santa Fe, generally speaking, have had more left-leaning representatives. The Allen shooting has pretty conservative Republican lawmakers, namely Representative Jeff Leach, and he gave a very emotional speech. I kind of alluded to it earlier, that I thought was very interesting in what he said and what he didn't say.
It doesn't have to be this way. I'm not sure there are any bills in front of us this morning, this session, that could have prevented this. I don't know.
And so that kind of, it almost, for gun control advocates, was like 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, because it sounded like some of the strongest words from a Republican saying something needs to be done, But then earlier, just a few days later, he kind of walked back on that and said, I'm very strongly about the Second Amendment. I don't think we should ever infringe on those rights. So I thought that was very poignant. And then he has had a lot of folks come up to him following the Allen shooting and look for answers. And it really is. There's just so many shootings that have happened in Texas to where there are so many victims who have come forward and so many of their family members who are really getting involved in the legislative process.
Yeah, and I'll ask, to ask his own question. Is there any legislation? Is there any legislation that would actually make a difference here, that would get people to vote, to agree on some type of change? I'll ask you, Brendan, first.
Well, I think some of these school safety measures will get that kind of support and have gotten that support. You talked about the panic button, for example. That's one that has a lot of support and will probably be achieved. I know there's been talk about things like shields for law enforcement that are necessary. Part of the reason they didn't go in Uvalde was they were worried about being shot themselves, the police. But hundreds of them stood outside while the gunman committed that heinous act. And so shields for law enforcement, more money for school safety, those are the kinds of things that I think can and will end up passing. But I think again, this is a country that is very divided on this issue, and it's just very difficult to get agreement on this or a lot of other issues.
Representative Goodwin, same question. No one-size-fits-all solution here, but what do we think the answer could be or is?
Well, I think background checks, even among Republicans, I feel like we should check and make sure someone has the right to purchase a gun to begin with. So that's a pretty simple thing. Right now we have some sales that happen without background checks. We could fix that. And I think there's probably that 80% agreement on that type of a bill. Honestly, more people die by gun through suicide than by homicide and accidents. And so I think a 3-day waiting period would be helpful for that situation, where somebody who is in a crisis, they go and they purchase a gun and they take immediate action. If we had a cooling down period, I think that would be helpful. We used to have that. There is a bill that I worked on with DPS actually, saying right now people can have a handgun license. With that license, they can go into a gun store and buy a gun without going through a background check. Now, they could have assaulted somebody recently and be on a revoked or suspended handgun license list. Right now, the gun seller does not have to check that list. My bill would have said that they do, and most gun sellers do, but not all, and it's not a law. So that was a real simple one. That bill got out of committee, but we just couldn't get it to the floor.
And it did come up there, but one of the most heartbreaking things from the Uvalde shooting was the response from law enforcement and hearing about how long it took and the frustration with how law enforcement handled that situation.
So the question now, has there been any meaningful legislation this session that addresses how to improve emergency response in the future and holding law enforcement accountable? Whoever would like to take that question. Brendan, we'll start with you.
Sure. As someone who is trained in the same system, the incident command system that law enforcement uses myself, the fact was that Arredondo, the chief of police of the campus police, was the incident commander. He should have known that. He'd gone through the training. They just had active shooter training. He was trained in ICS. He failed to lead. He failed to act. He didn't bring his radio with him, so he had no comms outside of the building. And so people were standing around looking at who's going to take action here. And ultimately, a group of heroes with the Border Patrol finally said, we're going in to neutralize the shooter. But I'll even take it a step back and say, I think the superintendent, the principal, and the school board have some questions that they need to answer, because it's pretty clear that there was lack of basic physical security. They had a door that was propped open that people knew about. They never put into work order to get it fixed. And this shooter apparently either knew about it or found out about it pretty easily, because that was his way in. And so I think a lot of things happen at the local campus, starting with the school itself, that really need to be looked at, because there was a total failure of response. And maybe that would not have saved all of the lives, but I believe it is pretty clear that a lot of lives could have been saved if those security measures would have been better, and if Arredondo, the chief of police of the campus police, would have acted in a much better fashion.
And same question, Representative Goodwin. Any meaningful legislation this session at all, in your opinion?
So we have had a bill that addresses training for our law enforcement. In fact, today we had a sunset bill for the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement for them to set up some gold standard protocols for law enforcement. So I think that that's certainly something that we are trying to address.
All right. The Texas Department of Public Safety has faced heavy criticism for their response to the Uvalde shooting, along with lack of transparency ever since. What, if anything, do you think DPS has learned over the last year?
Yeah, we'll start with you on that, Representative Goodwin. That's a question that a lot of people have asked.
Yeah, you know, Colonel McCraw, who is the head of DPS, has said that it was a failure. You know, and I think that afterwards that he's gone back to his DPS employees to do additional training to make sure that they understand who is in command in a situation like that. I think that hopefully they have done extensive training with their DPS and with law enforcement throughout the state to have a better response going forward.
I believe you called it an abject failure. Do we feel DPS has learned anything since then over the course of the year?
I think so. I think the biggest takeaway for them is probably that they need to share the tools, the resources, the knowledge and training that they have with local law enforcement around the state, because ultimately they are going to be the first responders. DPS cannot be first on the scene in most cases. It is going to be that local campus police. It's going to be the local city, the county sheriffs. Those are the folks that need to be the front line of defense when it comes to law enforcement. And so I think DPS's job is to share those best practices, training, give them the support that they need on the ground, because that's who's going to be responding 9 times out of 10 in these incidents.
And we have seen mass shootings and incidents, unfortunately, in other cities and states where we've seen the body camera footage released fairly quickly from that. That was something that people in Uvalde, those families, were really demanding to see, and it was not released very quickly. Has there been trust restored in DPS, you think, just based on how that entire situation was handled? Brendan, you were kind of talking about that. I'll ask you to continue.
Yeah, no, I think there's still a lot of skepticism and doubt based on that. I think transparency is paramount when these sorts of things happen. You have to open up and be honest about what happened and why it happened, and share those failures quickly and publicly. And the body cam footage tells the true story. It tells it unfiltered and raw, and I think that the families deserve to see that sooner rather than later.
And Representative, that'll be our final question for the night too. How do you feel in terms of DPS trust right now?
I think it will take more time. I think people need to see that they can trust DPS again, and yeah, I think it'll just take more time.
All right. Thank you both so much for joining us for this great conversation. We appreciate that. And this has been our Your Voice, Your Future roundtable discussion on school safety.
We certainly appreciate you sending in your questions, and thank you again to our panelists for coming in and having this very important discussion with us. We appreciate you watching. Hope you have a great night.